The left was traditionally a revolutionary weaponization of the anguish of the working man to take on the big capitalist who was exploiting him. But that died out in 1990 when the Soviet Union fell apart, and in its wake was left a cultural woke left. The concern of this form of the left was more about the transformation of the values of the culture that it lived in, and it went about its project more intellectually, saturating into all the institutions in the West. But it wasn't crazy politically violent. Up until recently. We have just seen Charlie Kirk get executed in public. This is the continuation of a motif of political assassination attempts over the last year. Donald Trump had several happen to him. Obviously, the most famous one with the bullet whizzing by his head. Somebody showed up to Nick Fuentes' house and attempted to shoot him while he was streaming. There are several transsexual school shooters and big incidents regarding this. Over in Europe, you've seen the leader of Spain's Vox party get shot in the face in 2023. Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico was shot multiple times as well. It seems like there's a rapid escalation in the amount of political violence. So does this mean that this cultural force that was quite weird, the woke movement, is now radicalizing and merging with that old spirit of the left to become a militant and aggressive revolutionary force? Should we expect to see an anarchic assassination network of transsexual shooters take on Trump's reactionary America? Well, all of these questions are what I'm going to explore. Today, we will take a look into the psychology of the left and ask ourselves, looking at the history, what we should expect to see in the future, how this will stimulate a response in the right, and what type of chaos that might cause across the Western world. Let us begin with the psychology, because if we wish to understand leftism, we're trying to marry these two distinct historical versions of it, and both of these are psychological phenomenon. Nietzsche and Dostoevsky observed the 19th century, 20th century version of leftism that leads to the communist revolution in Russia, and they're seeing a revolution among the lower classes taking on the upper classes. And the way this revolution is conducted is by stimulating resentment, stimulating aggression and anger in their minds and their souls about their situation, about the exploitation they see from those above them, in order to trigger a revolution. It's a very specific psychological orchestration. And in fact, the overthrowing of Russia in 1917 by Lenin is done in some sense as a psychological operation. The Germans, Ludendorff, has Lenin in his captivity, and he talks to him and he says, wow, we should really send this guy into Russia because he's insane. If I get my hands on him after the fact, I'm going to strangle him myself because he's a monster. But we want to send monsters on our enemies. They send in Lenin, and Lenin rabble-rouses the people from the bottom and overthrows the Tsarist system. Throwing a revolution against a ruling class requires you to be able to stimulate enough resentment and hate that it does boil over into violence and tears down the system as it is. As intellectuals and counter-elites begin to realize how powerful this resentment is in the modern age because populations are so big, they begin to exploit it more and more towards their own ends. And this means that its evolving form becomes more and more bizarre and intense, to the point where you see it bloom into pure hatred for white people to an irrational extent. This here is a gentleman from the 1960s. Now listen to how similar this sounds to our time today. A lot of what we see right now is not that new.
I remember going to the last above-ground weather, it was the Weatherman or the Weather Underground, the last above-ground convention. And sitting in a room, and the question that was debated was it or was it not the duty of every good revolutionary to kill all newborn white babies? And at that point, it seemed like a relevant framing of an issue. The logic being, hey, look, through no fault of their own, these white kids are going to grow up to be part of an oppressive racial establishment internationally. And so really, your duty is to kill newborn white babies. And I remember one guy kind of tentatively and apologetically suggesting that that seemed like it may be contradictory to the larger humanitarian aims of the movement and being kind of booed down.
The Weather Underground was a militant terrorist group from the 1960s and 70s, deploying the concepts of civil rights and saying that we need to use violence in order to achieve this revolution that we're setting out. If we are going to save the world and save mankind, we're going to have to tear down this oppressive system built by the white people at any means necessary. Now, this is bizarre for a lot of people as it is, but it's not even the deepest level of this problem. It's not really penetrating into the soul of some of these people and what level of anguish they have reached. And actually, the phenomenon we see in our time is the best expression of this. The transsexual, specifically the transsexual school shooter. You see this in Audrey Hale, who went around killing Christian children, and she has diaries. Lots of these people write about their worldviews and talk quite honestly about how they feel about reality. And you see inside of it a really twisted hate for reality. In Audrey's diary, she constantly talks about hating life and being born wrong. She even says, "My only true motivation is mass suicide," and that will become important in a minute. She writes down, "Why does my brain not work right? 'Cause I was born wrong. Nothing on earth can save me. Never-ending pain. Religion won't save me." This person is clearly in anguish, and they're seeking salvation from this anguish in a very human way. You see here in other notes, "Love will find me. Once my body loses me, I will be whole again. We will be in a perfect world and our hearts will truly be together again, and our hearts will find each other no longer in pain." Now, Audrey does say that her stated goal is to kill white people, that she thinks that black people should rule and white people should fall, and every white person who has lived and died, I hate you all. These are very clear manifest beliefs as well. That motif and archetype is there, but that is coming from a self-hate that is buried deeper in the problem of suffering. Now, what do I mean by that? This is the religious question, the psychological first principle of all religions. To live in samsara is to experience suffering, to engage in suffering and cruelty, like when you have to eat food, you have to kill animals, and to participate in a world that's going to put you down, you're going to get laughed at, you're going to go through injuries, people are going to die, your life is going to be hard, things will go wrong, and you will live in pain. It gets even worse if you're unhealthy or you're sick. Then you live in constant pain. You can't think straight about your pain, and you fall into deep pits of despair. This can poison your mind. This is the psychology of Gnosticism, or as Nietzsche would say, life denial. You are wrought up in a huge amount of suffering and pain, and eventually you say, why am I even here? Why do I have to live? Why do I have to exist? Life is nothing but anguish and suffering and pain. That's all it's ever been to me. What am I even supposed to do here? And this will turn you against reality, turn you against life itself. And this sounds strange to some people, but this is not only not uncommon, it is persistent phenomenon throughout all of history. You always see cults and little cultures and motifs of people struggling with these anxious questions. The foundation of most of our major religions is on the question of suffering. Nietzsche, one of the greatest philosophers, spends all his time finding an answer to this problem of suffering. It's one of the main aspects of his philosophical worldview. So when your anguish is that massive, your response can be to turn on life, to say life is crooked and evil, and my suffering has no meaning, I'm just stuck in a torture chamber. So you're going to hate existence. And what is the center of existence? Yourself, your consciousness, your being. You'll want to go against this. You might attack your body in some way, try to destroy yourself. That's what suicide is. Or you might turn around and form a way of looking at the world that makes you hate everything about yourself. You hate yourself because you want to transform into something that doesn't feel pain. You want to become an Ubermensch. That might be maybe a healthy expression of this. You go to the gym. You develop a stronger mind. But that can easily go wrong. You say to yourself, right, well, what's the simplest way to transform myself? Death. Destroy myself. And of course, this requires you to hate your identity. I hate that I'm white, and therefore I hate all white people. You'll hate your family around you. You'll hate them for their whiteness. You'll hate society as it is because that's what reality is. How can you affirm reality when you define your relationship with reality as hate? It always opposes you against everything that is natural and ordered. Nature becomes evil. The world, society, your institutions, your systems, these all have to be evil necessarily, and you have to be against them if you're in enough pain. You have to be a revolutionary against the world. God himself has to be a monster that you hate. Christianity, your religion, your traditional religion, whatever it is, you hate him because he created the world as it is. Or you'll say to yourself, the God that all the plebs believe is some type of evil God. And there's actually a secret God that only you know, who really doesn't think that you should be here at all, that you've actually been enslaved by these monsters, and it's your job to free them. And you see this motif show up, that these people often see themselves as enlightened. Woke, this is obviously the idea of Gnostic, they've woken up to this situation. Audrey, the shooter, said that herself and the Columbine killers are gods. They are the archons, the enlightened ones, the ones breaking the chains. And so her revolutionary violence against a load of innocent Christian children, she's breaking the chains of this reality because this reality is bad. Now, before people accuse me of being James Lindsay and start saying, oh, woke right, woke left, it's all Gnosticism, something like this, I'm not saying these things are the same. I'm saying they spring from the psychological root of anguish, of suffering. It is a very common problem we all deal with. Because if you're going to have a nervous system and be conscious, you're going to experience pain. And understanding why you're in pain is a difficult question to answer. That's what religions typically provide you. But what do we live in? An atheistic society that doesn't offer explanations. Instead, you have these weird school teachers, bureaucrats, psychologists giving you explanations for your pain that are highly culturally charged, like, for example, oh, you're in the wrong body, cut your testicles off, change your gender, things like this. Oh, take these pills, consciousness is just a set of operations whirring through this meat machine that you have that we can adjust with various chemical compounds. This is not sufficient. It's very, very obvious, and the culture that has been built all around us is generating these type of people because it can't answer these questions. So shouldn't we dive into this properly? Historical examples of this blow my mind, and I think they illustrate this point quite well. One of my favorite is the recent phenomenon of Heaven's Gate. Now look at all the interesting commonalities you see in this little cult and our current woke movement. Heaven's Gate was a UFO suicide cult. The Heaven's Gate cult used words like transhuman, and the leaders even castrated themselves. They followed along this idea that there was a divine spark inside of us. We have a conscious mind, we have a magical soul, and it's imprisoned in a vessel, a container that is not really who we are, not really something we should be attached to. Our bodies can surely be modulated in whatever way we wished. And the idea of what the world is, what reality is, or specifically in this view, what the earth is that it's a fallen, poisoned realm, afflicted by the passions of life. If you listen to a Nietzschean will say the passions of life are the center of our existence. We should affirm them. We should say to ourselves, our lusts, our will to ambition, our desire to craft art in our image, this is all good. This is all the expression of the will to power. It's the foundation of all that is good and true. Somebody in Heaven's Gate cult would say the opposite. They would say that these passions that we have, they hold us, they pull us down to this world. And the only reason we have them is because we're trapped inside this meat vessel, this container. And it has testicles, it has urges, and it shoots them up into our consciousness. Through electricity, it poisons us with hunger pangs and sexual anxiety about having partners so that we want to go and gain status in the world and get a job so that we can conquer people. And we need to eat food so we can become big and strong to look sexy. And they deny all this. They say that's wrapping us up in samsara like a Buddhist. They say that these are just tricks to grab our consciousness and pull it down and get us to invest, to make a house, to seek sexual partners, to consider our sexuality, to go after ambition. These are all terrible things. And so if you castrate yourself, you free yourself from this, and you allow your divine spark to think for itself, to finally be liberated from these horrible things that pull us down to this monstrous world where we hurt each other and we cause pain and we hurt animals, where we become monsters. And this all makes sense if you stand on the first principle that reality is evil, this world is evil. If you experience suffering and you try to find a reason for this suffering and you don't get a good explanation, except that the world itself is a simulation, a matrix, made by the devil, that it should not be the way it is, and you're imprisoned inside of this vortex, this world. And people like Buddha and Jesus are trying to free you from that. The Heaven's Gate cult believed that there were enlightened beings who lived on a far-off planet, and that they would come every now and again and collect some people to bring them off into this planet, which was known as the next level. Now, when they would do this, they would bring a spaceship that would come through a portal, and then it would pick all these people up, UFO cult, you know, and it would bring them aboard this ship, and it wouldn't get rid of the body, because the body is a source of an awful lot of problems. It's attached to this world of nature. And so they would bring them aboard the ship, and they would take the recruits, and they would be biologically and chemically transformed into extraterrestrial beings, which would not have a gender and would not be weighed down with all the urges of the body. And then they would be brought into this new world to be part of this new culture. Now, Applewhite, the leader, believed that he would not get aboard this spaceship and most others unless they were very pure. They were not spiritually tainted by this fallen world that we are a part of. And so this is why he castrated himself. He didn't want to have these urges attacking him. He didn't want to have these influences in his mind, his sexuality. So he was like, right, we'll get rid of this. And this would obviously prove that he was serious about what he was doing. So he underwent castration. And there were several attempts at castration of different people. The group initially attempted to castrate one of its own members. A former nurse offered to do the job. But this almost resulted in the patient's death and caused at least one member to leave Heaven's Gate. They were like, whoa, this is starting to look like a bit of a cult here, guys. And then every castration afterwards was done in the hospital. Now, the idea behind castration for them obviously was to get rid of the temptation of the passions, but it was also related to this idea of how our souls should be what define us, not our bodies, not our sexual genitalia, anything like that. That seems like a ludicrous thing when you think about it, you know? Because what are you? Oh, I'm my conscious mind, my soul. I want to be judged based on my mind. And this body and my boobs and my, you know, my big willy, that's not exactly something that I want people to think of when they think of me. I want them to think of my intellect, my imagination, my reason. I want the divine spark to be my definition. And so for this reason, a lot of what they did was about wiping out gender identity. They would all wear the same dress-down tracksuits and a pair of Nikes. They would all shave their hair off and get rid of this type of association, this type of idea. They wanted to neutralize people's physical identities so their spiritual identity, their mind, shone through with more power. Now, this all culminated in 1997 when Applewhite and various other people in the group started to say, I think the aliens are coming. I think it's about to happen now. I think this is it. They believed that the Hale-Bopp comet was a portal, and as it was passing by Earth, it was going to reveal the gates to heaven, and the alien spaceship would come out, fly by, and pick up anybody's souls who were ready to leap into it. Of course, jumping into a spaceship when you're weighed down by this body is a bit of an issue, so when the moment came, the 39 members in the compound committed a ritual mass suicide. They all poisoned themselves with some tainted applesauce, and then they put bags over their heads and strangled each other. And the weirdest thing of all about this is that this happened during the dot-com bubble at the rise of the internet, so the way they afforded this large compound in San Diego is that they were internet entrepreneurs. They were all making websites for people. And they have a website called Heaven's Gate that you can still look up, that's still up. It's still there. And there's lots of videos of them explaining what they think. Here is the leader, Applewhite himself, and I'll warn you, he has pretty intense eye contact. I think you would have been able to guess. He might have been, you know, a cult leader if you kind of looked at it. But he explains all this with sincerity. This is what he believed.
I'll tell you who I am. As to whether or not you believe who I am or not is up to you. I'm from kingdom level above human. I'll tell you about a kingdom level beyond here, and if you want to go there, then you have to follow me, because I'm the guy who's got the key at the moment. And it requires that you, if you move into that evolutionary kingdom, that you leave behind everything of human ways, human behavior, human ignorance, human misinformation. Now, breaking away from the world is not easy. It's difficult. It's tough. And breaking away doesn't mean that, I'm going to go live in some place with this little cult and I'll, spend time on weekends or at least on holidays with the family that I left because they're no. It means that you leave that world behind. You even become another individual. It means that even the mind that you had as a human is aborted, and the soul that was given to you is filled with next level information, next level mind, and a new creature is born.
So several important lessons to take from this. This man is appealing to a real anguish within people's souls. He's not that convincing or magical with his words, yet he says something that people resonate with, that there is something wrong with this world. And that is a human emotion that people often feel. People are in pain and they want an explanation, and this is offered to them as an explanation, and this will seduce a certain amount of people. Second of all, people can be persuaded to do the craziest things. If you can get inside people's minds and really appeal to this deep anxiety, you can walk them step by step all the way into committing ritual mass suicide in San Diego. This is what happens with this man. He persuades these people that the UFO is coming, that he is one of these people from the future. And lastly, this is a brilliant way to understand Nietzsche's framework of morality. People accuse him of all sorts of ludicrous things, but Nietzsche was fundamentally targeting this psychological disposition, this desire to escape into another world. I'm sure you've heard Nietzscheans talk about this. There's otherworldliness that people get obsessed with. But the thing here is that you take this to its logical conclusion and it transforms into a literal death cult. Now, if you say to yourself, what defines the left? What defines the woke movement as we see it? You'll start to realize that almost all of it is orientated towards death. It's an assault upon life itself, an inhibition of life-affirming instincts, self-confidence in yourself, in your race, in your people, in your identity, negated. Bad. The idea of creating children, negated, bad. You should be antinatal. You should not want to create children because children destroy the environment. Because creating more white people means creating more oppressive people. If you express natural gender or gender roles, accept what nature gave you, and go with the roles that nature gives to this is bad. Because nature's wrong, because nature is a proxy for reality. So that is evil on first principle. You have to go against this. If you try to enforce borders or stuff, if you try to enforce a state or a project or a civilization, something that chimps and dogs and everything does, assert territory, this is evil. If you try to embrace these ambitions inside of your heart and achieve greatness, that is evil as well. Anything to do with expressing life is evil. And so the left, the woke, they take on this inhibitory function, where they are attacking the instincts of life, which is what explains what you see all around you. People say, why is the left so crazy? Why do things seem so upside down? Why are people out there prostrating themselves, saying that I hate white people, I hate who I am, I don't want to have children? Why does this happen? And it is actually rooted in this. It's the psychology of life denial, of the death cult, of hating the world, extrapolated out to a civilizational level. This is closer to an autoimmune disorder than it is a worldview. In fact, your goal should be to induce it on your enemies so they fall down and disintegrate. And there's every likelihood that there's bad actors out there pushing this on you because it's so demoralizing and challenging to have this worldview in your mind. Because it is about exploiting anguish and turning people's hearts against life and making them develop a morality of self-destruction and fighting against life, which leads you to death, makes you redundant in the game of life. Nietzsche in Twilight of the Idols articulates out his model for this. He says, I will formulate a principle. Every sound morality is ruled by a life instinct. Any sort of obstacle or hostile element on the road of life is thus cleared away. Conversely, the morality which is antagonistic to nature is directed against the life instincts. Now, what is he saying here? When somebody uses that big lofty word morality, you can often notice hiding underneath it is these death cult values, these anti-life values. Specifically in the mainstream left, you see this all over the place. And you can objectively judge this as wrong. People say, well, morality is relative. Nietzsche was a moral relativist. No. You can assess these if you want to say, I value life. And if you don't want to say that, fair enough. But if you're going to say, right, I value life, life is obviously inherently good on some level. It's very hard to judge that it's not, because that's why we're here. If you're going to run with that, you can assess morality and say, well, what way is morality that's being promoted? How is it bringing us towards life? And you start to lift up the stones underneath our popular culture, and you start to see it's all these maggots. It's this death cult that is there. The right are not known for their savviness, for their intellectual dynamism, if you so will. But if they were, this is what they would be gripping onto, because this is the unifying spirit of the right. You see in the right even a war in Christianity, where they're trying to say, well, Christianity is supposed to be based. And this form of Christianity that hates the Europeans and is soppy and weak and pathetic, that's the wrong form of Christianity. But really what they're saying is that they want Christianity to have a life spirit. They want the values to be life. And some forms of Christianity, many dominant ones, drift almost towards this anti-life death cult that we see. Now, it's important not to politicize these things, because political parties don't represent the deep echoes of your soul. Be very careful there. But this is the spiritual foundation of the culture war that we have lived through, the psychological war that we are going through. All of us face anguish. All of us face discontent with reality as it is, with pain, with problems, with purpose. And you can respond to that by turning against life and accusing life of being evil. You can become a Heaven's Gate Gnostic. Or you can take the life-embracing approach, which says that strength is the answer to the problem of suffering. Because when you become stronger, pain becomes less. This is a fundamental biochemical reality. When you have an injury or you have chronic pain or something like that in your body, that's almost as much a signal of your body telling you that there is weakness as there is damage. You build up well-conditioned supporting muscles around your shoulder girdle, and an awful lot of the pain you have in your shoulder moving will go away. Strength heals suffering. And this transforms into an overarching ideological perspective that encourages health and strength as an answer to these problems. You take a Gnostic, you take somebody who is at war with the world, and you might check out an awful lot of their behavior and realize that perhaps they've got a terrible diet, they've maybe cut their testicles off, they've done things to abuse themselves, and this has spiraled them down into a negative way of thinking about reality, which has led them to where they are. And this sounds trite, it doesn't cover everything, certainly, and people can have much more profound problems going on. But you'll be surprised how more often than not it is a problem of lack of encouragement, lack of allowing people to seek their strength that leads to this downward spiral. It is a very basic spiritual problem. Now, with all that being said, with all that shutting out and right-wing Nietzscheanism, Gnosticism has some points. It is normal to feel like there's something wrong with reality, that the world is fallen, and that you have a divine spark that is imprisoned in this fallen world. That something is not quite right. You don't feel like you should be from here. I notice this quite a lot on the right, and more so as of late. People look around and see mass immigration changing the Western world. They look at the histories of the past and they say, wow, things were so glorious only 150 years ago. What happened? How are we here? This isn't right. This doesn't make sense to me. Why am I seeing my culture get washed away? I'm seeing hip-hop dominate my culture. There's no more classical music anymore. It seems like the elite are coordinated specifically to create lack of health, create sickness, to create illness. What happened with the lockdowns, various things like this. There's this feeling that there's something deeply wrong and that you shouldn't even be here. Some people will, grasp onto spiritual ideas, that we Hyperboreans were not from this realm, that we have actually fallen down into the Kali Yuga, And we're not supposed to be here. We're watching the passing away of the great world. We're going downwards into a darker reality. So the spirit inside the transsexual that distorts and twists is built on this anguish that you might even see in the right winger. In some sense, when you see a Zoomer bodybuilding and weightlifting, they are doing this when they're trying to transform their body. They're saying to themselves, oh, this body I have, I don't identify with it. I can imagine myself as the Übermensch, as the superhuman. And in order to become that image inside of my mind, I'm willing to take hormone replacement therapy. Look at Alex Eubank, for example, you know. I'm willing to take drugs, testosterone. I'm willing to take hormones in order to become the body I see in my mind. Transsexual is doing the same thing. So there's a fascinating psychological substructure here that I notice people don't point out. They get bedazzled by the words. Oh, it's Gnosticism. It's not Gnosticism. It's this and that. There's a psychological anguish here that is critical because this is what gets weaponized into political action. This is what I'm trying to point out to you. This psychological anguish can manifest in all sorts of profound ways, like historical Gnosticism. But it can also get weaponized into political force. And then when somebody believes that the world itself is evil, the level of political violence they are willing to commit is enormous. They are willing to overthrow all concept of order in order to get there. And this brings us into the revolutionary psychology, when this becomes politically active. Because you see in Heaven's Gate this desire to leave this world that turns into self-destruction. And you will see that this is the undercurrent of modern Western culture. It is promoted by hostile outsiders, but it is also something that comes from within us. It is our nihilistic death of God anguish. But there comes a point where people don't want to leave this reality and destroy themselves, where they might say to themselves, I'm going to take out my anguish on reality. And that is the Nietzschean ressentiment. And the way to look at this is actually to look at one of the prophets of leftism, which is Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky writes a book back in the mid-1800s called Demons. And in Demons, he is doing a study of the people around him during a moment of political violence. There's a political assassination because people are trying to, push Russia towards this new society to catch up with Western Europe. And Dostoevsky, like an investigator who loves the psychology of people, begins to examine all the people around him and do this sort of like parody, satire, exaggeration of the way that they're all thinking. And he creates something that many people describe as prophetic. At the time he publishes Demons, all the characters seem just a little bit too crazy. They're predicting this idea that, one of the leaders, this charismatic aristocrat, was a little bit, mad in the head. He basically sets out this program where, in order to create a sense of total freedom that is necessary for the 10% of intellectuals and ambitious Übermensch, these supermen, these rational men, these aristocratic people of the soul that are necessary to give them total freedom. There's going to have to be a total despotism, subjugation of the other 90%. This is what's being said, And Dostoevsky's writing this down. And there's these implications of this total police state, this total equality brought together in people's slavery. To be equal, you will all be slaves. That is how your equality will be achieved. This paranoia of everybody telling on each other and this constant social surveillance in order to enforce this new order, to bring forth this Enlightenment project. And this is getting preached by this crazy character. And people, all the people who read this at the time are like, Dostoevsky, you're like, come on, this is a bit too crazy. What are you talking about? This is never going to happen. And of course, wind on 50, 60 years, and everybody's living through exactly that. Now, how did Dostoevsky predict this? Because this is uncanny. It's a bit of a slog to get through, but it is uncanny because he looks within the soul of these people. Like Nietzsche does. Nietzsche probably was inspired by many of these works when he writes things like Tarantulas, the preachers of equality who promote these beautiful ideas that they say are going to, solve all of the world's problems and ills, when secretly they have this vengeance, this storm of vengeance that they're wishing to express upon the world. They have this strong impulse to punish. Be wary of those with a strong impulse to punish. And Dostoevsky is seeing this in demons, and he calls it demons because this is what he understands it to be. He sees that each of these characters has in their left hemisphere this constellation of gorgeous French Revolution ideas. And they all exist in this Russian state, which is this established order, which he says, listen, which each character says, but as Dostoevsky says as well, he says, listen, we know it's not perfect, but it is the established way of conducting yourself in the world. And I know you have anguishes and perversions and problems, but, taking them out on the establishment will lead to ruin if we're not careful. And this is consistently what you see, that you have this highfalutin aristocrat, and he deep down has a lot of psychological problems. He has these perversions, he has this sort of cruelty inside of him. And this is a psychological issue. It's something inside of his soul that's a bit corrupted and damaged. It's his Gnostic anguish with his reality. He expresses it in weird ways. And he can't be honest with it. It's, Jungian, Nietzschean. And he cannot be conscious. He does not want to become conscious of the demon within. And so he pursues these political revolutions with this constellation of beautiful ideas of secular humanism. How could you be against this? The love of all of mankind. And really what is happening is there's these demons, these little perversions, these little instincts for malice and cruelty are actually sneaking up. And they are wearing these ideas as masks. And they're attempting to throw this revolution so these ideas can get out and their barbarism can get expressed. And they're coming up with an elaborate rationalization for that. That's what Dostoevsky sees in demons, and that's critical to understand. And of course, what does he suggest? He points out the death of God. He says, listen, our traditional religion, Christianity, has a psychological function. God has a psychological function because God and Christ purge these demons inside of your soul. They have a way of dealing with this Gnostic anguish inside of your heart. Now, there's a set of theories I'd like to bring up to illustrate this idea because it's very important. I'm going to start with one I've brought up many times before, which is the posterior medial frontal cortex. This location within your brain that is your threat detection center, a part of your brain that sits there like a lighthouse looking out for problems in your life and identifying them. And it is something that you can actually turn off with magnets that will modulate your value system. When it is turned on, it is looking out for threats and it is helping you assess problems and then adapt and evolve to deal with these problems. But it is also something that creates the political concept of friend-enemy distinction. This posterior medial frontal cortex is looking out there in the world and deciding who is on my team, who is a part of my ideology or part of my race or part of my nation. In the most basic sense, who's the part of my tribe in the jungle. And if it goes out into the jungle, it's looking for problems. It sees that there's a weird tree. It sees that there's a river there it needs to jump over. And then it might see a stranger. And it is implicitly racist. It sees the stranger and it categorizes them as potential threat, dangerous, be wary, be careful. It is against strangers. It is closed-minded. It is a racist. Now, in order to enhance this racism, this is the part of your brain that creates cognitive dissonance. So it makes you close your mind and turn off your conscience when dealing with things that are problems and threats. And then on top of this as well, it is also the part of your mind that seems to generate the concept of God. And why would we know this? Because when you turn this off, when you shut down the posterior medial frontal cortex, what happens? You see a modulation in people's beliefs, you see a change in their moral valence where they become less racist, they become more open to foreigners, they become more interested in other people's perspectives, and they also become more atheist. They stop wanting to believe, they stop believing in God, they stop needing religious architecture to explain to them death and the afterlife. So here we actually have the structure of liberal woke atheism, leftism if you will, which is the secular atheist, open-minded anti-racist. And this is coming from a part of our brain that is tied to our nationalistic collectivism, our chud psychology. So when we turn off the threat detection center, you transform into a libtard. But when you turn it on, you become an aggressive, close-minded neo-Nazi. And this is something that's built inside of our minds, built inside of our souls, built inside of our brain matter. And it modulates and influences our value system. Now, why I'm bringing this up is because when you look at Dostoevsky's writings about what was going on in Russia, he noticed that there was a combination here of this value shift. He would always say that when people lost God, when he noticed people becoming anti-religious, they also became anti-Russian and anti-nationalist. They turned against their own nation, which is this phenomenon that we even see today. Like, why do all these liberals hate our nations? Why do we hate our flags? They're happy to wave a Palestinian flag, but they don't want to wave their flag. And you go back 150 years ago and you see the same phenomenon, the same issue. People negating this self-identity. Now, what are we looking at here? What are these two vectors and these two forces? Well, actually, in an interesting way, one of them is the pursuit of life, which is to be a racist neo-Nazi. And the other is the pursuit, perhaps, of truth, where you get to turn off all these implicit attachments life has, pulling you to be a madman, and instead encouraging you to engage in the fight for the world and close your mind and turn on cognitive dissonance. Instead, you drop all this stuff. And this may allow you to develop an individualistic conscience. But the downside of this is that you align with death. This stops you being able to engage with life. So there's this weird balance or valence here. If you want to go one side, you're going to lose the other. If you want to go towards life, your mind is going to have to shut down. You're going to have to collectivize, join a team, lose your individuality, and become a little beast fighting for your team. And this will transform you into a godly racist, a Christian nationalist, a neo-Nazi, whatever you want to call it. A pagan of the soul. You go to the other direction, what are you going to generate? You're going to generate this openness, this ability to be more individual, this ability to have more of a conscience, maybe have more of an independent conscience. But you're going to let go of the project of life. And you're going to actually start to see many of these things that are part of life as probably evil, such as nationalism, such as God. Now, let's build onto this a second idea. Because if you go back to the origin of Christianity, the religion of the West for the past 2,000 years, you will see that this dynamic is actually right there and present. In Jesus's time, there was a load of Jewish chuds that were trying to set up a nationalistic movement. And this is the Jews' justifications for killing Jesus. They say to themselves, all right, this guy, this Jesus, is getting in the way of our nationalism. There is this group called the Zealots who are like super fascists. They were like, listen, we're going to have to fight the Romans. The Romans are the worst. They're all Italians. They're all forcing us to eat pizza. They're all forcing us to have espressos all the time. So what we're going to do is we're going to take them on. And we need to be an organized collective. So they shut their minds off. And they say, right, we're going to shut out here. They even went around attacking Judeans who weren't, engaged with the nationalistic project enough. And they did that to Christians because Christians were showing up and sort of being a little bit Gnostic. A lot of Christians won't like this, especially Christian nationalists who want Jesus to be like, Hitler 2.0 or Hitler 1.0 maybe or something like this. But Christianity is very Gnostic. In fact, many of the earliest texts we have from Christianity, like the Gospel of Thomas and stuff, they're not put in the canon of the church. The weight of the Gnosticism inside of them is enormous. Nietzsche would write about the true nature of the Savior, saying that he is this sort of psychological mystic. The kingdom of God is within, meaning that it is an entirely psychological process. And what is Jesus basically saying? You go out into the world and you pick up all this anguish and you pick up all these pains and these urges and you try to search for meaning. You try to search for a way out of it. And maybe you will graft onto self-destruction and the demonic forces of destroying yourself, or maybe you will graft onto collectivism. You will get involved in some revolutionary project, wouldn't you? And Christ is saying, no, you must go within and purge yourself of all this and release the demons from you and give to Caesar what is Caesar and step out of all of this and, become like a sort of Eckhart Tolle type character and make peace within yourself. And this is like the Gnostics stepping out of the nationalistic project, stepping out of the hard right fascist project. And I can imagine that many of the Jews at the time would have been accusing Jesus of being a blasphemer, that he's going against the Old Testament project of militant Judaism, which is obviously what he got tried for, and him going around and saying, I am reality, I am God, I am the truth, this type of thing. So this is the origin of this religion. It is a psychological religion, purging collectivism, purging nationalism, but also purging this whole concept of ideological collectivism, I'd imagine, in order for it to be a psychological force. And this is something someone like René Girard goes into, saying what happened with Jesus. In this one moment, all the major vectors in Western politics come together. You have the Jewish Pharisaic chuds trying to form a nationalist movement, and they want to kill Jesus. And then you have the Roman state who want to, act as automatic robots. And everybody binds together and participates in this blood ritual where they kill essentially an innocent man, God himself. And this is a destruction of the truth, a murder of innocence, and a murder of the conscience. Everybody's conscience turns off and they all become chuds. And everybody has all this pent-up anguish and energy, this fury inside of them. And so what they do is they scapegoat Jesus. They say, well, this weak little Jewish slave, this little cock, this Christ cock, let's kill him. Let's beat the shit out of him and stick him up on a cross. And it will purge us of all our bad feelings. We'll get them all out of us. And so that's what happens. That's what all the negative force gets projected on Jesus. And so why is the Western religion so fascinating and interesting? Why is it such a profound religion? Because it's a psychological religion. Because it offers you that purging power where you have all this resentment and you might want to, become a revolutionary communist or a totalitarian fascist or something like this. Yet if you go to this religion, it will neutralize this because you can project that anger on the image of Christ, which is a perfectly beautiful, innocent person, a shining light of innocence, and it purges you of this. It allows you a psychological revolution, and you can overcome these things. Now, does this mean that Christianity, as it's always practiced, is perfect in this way? Definitely not. Historically, it goes in all sorts of different directions. But I can see the purpose here. I can see this function. I can understand this. And Jung, Dostoevsky, even Nietzsche, to a large extent, are saying that, if God dies, if this purging, psychologically stabilizing force goes away, shit's going to get fucking crazy, man. And we're going to break out. And so this is what Dostoevsky notices, that we don't have with the loss of religion, our psychological intelligence actually drops. These mechanisms that were built into Christianity to help us scapegoat God himself in order to purge ourselves of our inner demons, this is all lost. And so what happens is the demons gradually gain ground and power. And all the people he notices being atheist and being secular, they grasped the most beautiful ideas, the Luciferian high noble ideals, but within them are the most toxic monsters. And always you see the expression of this. And he points it out in many different directions. And he does this brilliant thing where he points out that all participants are guilty. There are Jews from the Pale of Settlement who get involved in this movement. And of course, they have resentment against the establishment of Russia. And they're getting this out. They're saying that they want a secular revolution, probably because they're trying to get out of the Pale of Settlement. But there is also that anger, that vengeance that they're looking for. And then you also look at the Russian aristocrats. You say, maybe the Jews did everything. But no, Dostoevsky's pointing out and saying, listen, we have these Russian aristocrats. And they are almost like jaded, perverted, bored elites. And they look at Russia and look down on this disgusting peasant, potato-eating junkyard that is their country, and they go over to La France. And in La France, they're talking about the enlightenment and the croissants, and it's beautiful. So they read all this French literature, and they read about this French Revolution, and it's so glorious. Humanism, egalitarianism, equality. Wow, we should get that. But of course, what comes out of this? An expression of the aristocratic natural classism. Despite this idea of love of all of mankind and wanting to save the proletariat from the beast that is the Tsarist state, what does this aristocrat make? What does he do? He sets up this 10% rule over the 90%, but not like the Tsar with a maybe Christianity that is possible. No, instead it is a total murderous, exploitative despotism. It's Stalinism in its absolute sense. It basically predicts Stalinism. And then, of course, you have in the proletariat the exact same phenomenon. Anguish at their situation because they're lazy, because many of them are the dregs who are addicted to alcohol, who, don't take responsibility for themselves. Because it's very easy now, because the working man, the proletariat, the lower man, it's easy to sort of say, oh, these poor guys, they were exploited by all these forces, this type of thing. But they are equally guilty of the crime, because they won't make the most out of their reality. They resent their situation. They have alcoholism. They have various problems in poverty sink in many ways. And they won't do anything about it. And eventually they have this easy out where they can scapegoat the Tsar, the Russian state. And then all these charismatic leaders come and utilize this resentment inside of them. This leads to this revolution. So what is leftism in its core, in one of the most profound examples? Of course it is literally this force of the upper classes, the outsiders, the Jews, other minorities. Stalin was a Georgian. Like, what really forms with communism is this coalition of the outsiders, the counter-elite aristocrats who feel a little bit jaded and maybe left out of the Russian state. The Jews, the Georgians, the Belarusians, the all sorts of like outsiders. And then the proletariats, the undermensch. And they all bind together and go against the Christian core of Russia and the aristocratic state as it is. And they form this resentful super mob against it, pull the whole thing apart, and then gain control of it, promising the highest ideals possible. And then when they gain control of it, they enact a total despotism on everything and start to purge and murder everything. And of course, what do we see in the 1960s? What do we see in the psychology of these people? That they have an inherent self-hate. They have an inherent vengeance directed towards themselves. This sort of Gnostic negation of thyself. And these humanitarian ideas are masking psychological disorders. And so in the 60s, that guy in Weather Underground, he's saying like... So they're all talking about killing all white babies because they're going to be oppressors. And some guy is like, maybe this is a bad idea. Maybe we shouldn't do this. And everybody starts to say, maybe this isn't in alignment with the humanitarian goals that we have. And everybody shouts him down, shames him. Because that's their demons. They have a will to self-destruction because they're white, or else they might be outsiders who want to take vengeance on the core population. It could be something like this. This is the psychology and spirit that we're talking about. And it's predicated on this unconsciousness. And you rip away Christianity and God, and that is the biggest problem, because that is the psychological balancing force that mitigates against this insanity. And then it becomes the rise of the mob, this type of thing. And this leads into another critical point, because where does modern psychology come from? Where does our modern way of seeing reality come from? It comes from the psychological revolution that took place in the context of the French Revolution. The French Revolution was a transition not of just power, but also psychology. Before the French Revolution, the standard concept of how our minds were ordered was dominated by a Christianity that could enforce its psychological principles with violence. The church and the state were married. That was the point of secularism, separate the church and the state. Before that, the church could mandate psychological authority to the kings and say they have the divine right of kings. But furthermore, they could mandate their moral authority. If they thought that some woman needed to go for divorcing or cheating on her husband, needed to get punished, they could bring the police or the army and enforce that. If they thought some man was a bad guy who was blaspheming, they could come and they could punish him for this. They had the power of enforcement. If somebody had some type of disorder where they were acting crazy, demonic, they were able to categorize it that way. Say, well, he's possessed by a demon. He hasn't accepted Christ. Therefore, there's this purging or this constriction that can take place in your mind. And people obviously make an awful lot out of this. They say things like the Inquisition, they say all these terrible things. True, but this system obviously worked to some extent because it brought civilization so far. It was the psychological framework that was in place. And what happened in the French Revolution was the purging of that psychological framework and the lifting of a new way of seeing things. The priests become the, specters of doom. The kings become, ignorant, backwards people holding things back. And this is where we get the origin of right wing and left wing. This is where we get this breakdown, this splitting of the mind into these two vectors, into these two forces. And this brings us into this secularism, this atheism. A lot of it comes from here. And it's a psychological revolution. And if you were to say now as a right-winger that you're looking for, a revolution, you might think it's political what you're looking for. But the real victory, if you will, the triumph over leftism is necessarily a psychological triumph. Because what does liberalism and leftism own today? They own the categories of the mind. They have total psychological domination. This is what Foucault speaks about. The source of their power is totalitarian because they own the categories of the mind. Because they are able to call you crazy if you don't think like them. And that's power. That's real power. They can call you insane. They can mark racism as a mental illness. They can mark misogyny as this delayed, or incel rage as these deranged psychological self-categories or mental categories. They can mark you asserting, family boundaries or something like this. They can call that the authoritarian personality that leads to Hitler. They have this capacity to do this, because they have built up a large framework of psychological ways of seeing the world. And then when you feel sick, there's something wrong with your mind, or depressed, they will take you to a therapist, and you will sit down with a therapist, and they will install these categories of the mind inside of you. You don't go to a church. You don't go to a priest, even though, a confession box is free. You have to go to a therapist. It costs $200 for them to brainwash you and then offer you chemical pills because they can't solve your problems, so they need to give you drugs. And so their dominion comes from their ability to weaponize psychological categories such as hate. They can accuse you of being hateful if you're a hateful right-winger, possessed with demonic forces. This is what they'll say. And this is the source. This is so profound. And it's the undergirdle of society that you don't even notice, that people can't even think outside of, because it is the structure of their very mind. And is it even realistic? Most right-wingers are like, they're giving out about leftism or whatever. They think it's some political thing. But is anybody seriously going to go back to saying you have a demon inside of your head? Go back to a Christian psychological worldview? Do you think that's feasible? Maybe. I see people actually do it more and more now. I noticed with the Charlie Kirk shooting, people said this person who shot him was possessed by a demon. I saw that. And that happens more and more now. So you can see the psychological category is coming back, but will that become superordinate? Who knows? But it shows you what a real revolution would be. It would be the total overturning of those mental categories. And the great victory that has taken place for the left over the last 200 years has been their ability to seize those categories and define what they are. They get inside people's heads. During the communist revolution, they set up an institution called the League of Militant Atheists, and they would go around and purge religious institutions, find people trying to believe in God, go after Orthodox Christians and purge them, delete that way of thinking. I knew a Russian girl whose grandmother lived through the Soviet Union, and she said that she had never told anybody in her life that she believed in God until 1991. She had to wait for the Soviet Union to fall before she could even articulate that idea, because it was such a psychologically dominant state. Its whole mandate for power was the mind. Now, this is where things get really critical and important, because these are asserted as, such objective realities, these psychological realities. But I'm very interested in this idea that can you dig into, neuroscience, like objective things, brain science, and discover real foundations for our psychological beliefs. I point out the PMFC for precisely this reason, because that's such a head fuck. Like, it's so crazy. You're finding the moral values of racism and belief in the brain, tied to evolutionary institutions that are probably important. And the idea that we need to purge those is very dangerous. Now, those ideas do come with downsides, such as cognitive dissonance, that do need to be mitigated. But that doesn't necessarily affirm the opposite perspective as like inherently valuable, because that also comes with downsides, such as not being able to learn. So what do you do here? Is that what is needed for the future? A new psychology of the future? Is that what we're waiting for? Is that where things will become more sophisticated? I don't know. Let's see. Now let's move into the final phase that brings us up to the modern expression of wokeism, because we've gone through some psychological first principles, such as the eerie nature of Gnosticism. We've looked at the political aspects of this, which is the beginning of the Russian Revolution, how that relates to atheism, and the weaponization of resentment, which leads to the overturning of two major states, France and Soviet Russia. Now we need to look at how that weaponization began to fail. Because what happens after the conquest of Russia by this atheist secular superforce, by the demons, and the disciplining and destruction of their own state to create the Soviet Empire, and then the rapid, modernization of the Soviet state, this all takes place. And then the Soviet Union actually becomes quite successful, because despite the fact that these guys are such enormous haters, they are at the same time very, very organized, because they collectivize and forcefully organize the state in a very powerful way. And obviously with the stimulus of Nazi Germany coming in, this, forces them to get actually really, really well organized and professionalized. And so Stalin runs a pretty powerful state, and it takes over, it defeats Nazi Germany, the most incredible war in all of human history. For many people who lived through it, it was probably amazing that Stalin even managed to win that. He had to get help from the West, but the Germans seemed almost unbeatable at the start of it. And then after this, they eat up half of the world. And then the period that comes in the Cold War is this further psychological war. Leftism and the modern world that we live in is very psychological. And the nature of this psychological war is like Yuri Bezmenov. And what you see throughout the Cold War is this thing where the Americans are throwing color revolutions. They're throwing these revolutions to get their capitalist lackeys in Latin America and things like this. But on the flip side, what you're seeing is the Soviets come in and do their Marxist revolutions. And as Yuri Bezmenov describes this, because he lived through this, he worked in India where they were doing this, their goal is to go in and induce a state of destabilization inside of the minds of people, demoralize people, get people to turn against their race, their religion, their society, and their state, get them to turn against that so that they become demoralized and looking for something new. And then the Soviets offer them this solution of Marxism. They come in and they use all these useful idiots to conquer the state, and then they put in a pro-Soviet government, this type of thing. So this was the entire architecture of the next 70, 80 years. And so what is really built around the world at this time is the end of the imperial world. You have, Portugal's imperial empire is literally still there by the 1940s and 50s. You have these imperial systems all around there. And many people would say that capitalism was a cleaner extension of imperialism. And the Soviets would come in and obviously weaponize that very successfully. They would say, listen, these capitalists are just the old colonialists showing up in suits. Overthrow them. The state that you live under is an exploitative state. Overthrow them. And transform into Marxism, which is about getting your experience, and lift it up. And they actually racialize this. They say, you black man, you're the proletariat, you're the worker. Proletariats of the world unite. Our communist project is all about saving the entire world. So you need to overthrow yourself against these old capitalist states. So they do this all across the world. And they create these revolutions. They have these revolutions throw up. So they weaponize resentment. And they're very successful. And this actually shocks the Americans because at one point during the 60s, the Soviets begin to expand out. You see, obviously, everything that happens in China, but also they start to take parts of Africa, they start to take parts of India, and they take Cuba. We're talking like only a couple of miles away from Florida. They throw a communist revolution and succeed. And Cuba flips. And this is a panic moment because all of a sudden now the Western Empire is imploding. Weaponized resentment is showing itself as a more powerful psychological force than anything else. And it's winning. And the Americans are like, what happens if we get contracted into this tiny piece of like, the USA? What happens is like all Stalin needs to do, or all the Soviets need to do, is rush into Europe. They keep throwing color revolutions in Africa, in wherever, and this will happen. So we'll be trapped. We'll be this tiny little island surrounded from China and Russia. And oh my God, we can't let this happen. So what do the Americans do? What do the Americans do? John F. Kennedy comes in, an Irishman, and he becomes a libtard. He becomes a libtard cock. And he says that in order to fight against this, his major concern was the communist problem. We're going to have to liberalize the Western Empire. We're going to have to make it more open. And this is just a kind of a real politics thing. And so what does Kennedy do? Kennedy does several fascinating things that lead to very bad revolutions. He writes this book, The Nation of Immigrants. It's promoted by the ADL, so the Jews love this. And then he writes this, and he's talking and working through a reform to immigration policy to open it up to the world. Why? Because he wants to offer this friendly American dream to the whole world. Why? Because that sounds good. The Soviets coming in saying Marxism, weaponizing resentment, that actually works because capitalism does look like a colonial project of exploitation. So JFK comes in and he wants to revolutionize this. He wants to say, no, let's do the American dream. So everybody will want to buy into our lovely little state. So he does this. And he says, all right, let's go American dream mode, chuds. He pushes for this immigration reform. Now he gets shot before that gets put through, but he's pushing for it. And he does various things like set up international aid systems. So this is all about subtlety. He goes to all these governments and he says, listen, we're going to offer you the US aid, the NGO system that is now the substructure that's, destroying all of these countries around the world because America became so left-wing. But he sets up this infrastructure. So he goes into, Africa and things, and he says, yeah, we'll give you US aid. We'll set up NGOs. We'll funnel money into you. And we'll be the generous heads of the world. We'll funnel money into all you guys. And use it. We'll literally bankroll you like charity to make you rich and wealthy. So this is not capitalist exploitation. This is us literally sending you US aid. And this obviously is it's just like, this is based. Awesome. Free money. So all these NGOs get set up. And this gives them influence power. Kennedy sets up the special forces, the badass Navy SEALs, the Green Berets. Kennedy sets this up because he doesn't want to do things like Vietnam. He doesn't want to go in and invade with these wars because this looks bad. It's very good propaganda. Look, the imperialist capitalists are invading again. It's really bad propaganda. So he sets up targeted warriors, super warriors, which is really manly and great for the Americans because they're like, wow, I'd love to be a super warrior. And it also then allows them to do precision strikes that isn't as like crazy as this big invasion. So Kennedy does a lot of stuff like this, and go look into this. It's quite interesting. There is this huge liberalization in response to this beast of communism. And it makes sense. Maybe they just didn't see where this would go down the line. They didn't anticipate that it would lead to a total replacement of the American population. But this is the logic. There is logic here. Now, at the same time, there is this force entering into the consciousness of the Americans. So they're liberalizing in the government, number one. They're going more left, if you will, in the government. But obviously the communists are working a lot of psychological operations in America themselves. You have people like McCarthy saying there's communists everywhere, this type of thing. And there's this also natural thing taking place. So there's three forces here. This natural thing taking place where the American state and nation is so successful that they are also saying to themselves, listen, let's become a bit more woke. Let's turn off our posterior medial frontal cortex. We are the victors of the world. Everything is much more comfortable now. You see these natural institutions change inside of the mind. So you have these psycho-spiritual problems taking place. Just like Dostoevsky pointed out that the demons were being born inside of the Russian soul and the various demographics within that as well. You see the same thing happen in America. So what goes on in the 60s is a collection of fascinating things. The beginning of a non-manly, revolutionary, Russian communist overthrow state, a militant version of communism. Instead, something new is born, which is this civil rights wokeism. The civil rights wokeism starts to seed. And it blossoms out of all of this context. Martin Luther King, things like this, free the blacks, end segregation, US aid for the world. John F. Kennedy goes to Portugal. A lot of right-wing chuds don't like this, and he goes to Portugal and he says, stop your colonial empire. Because Portugal were losing Goa, they were losing Angola because of these communist revolutions. And instead of the Americans helping them keep this together, Kennedy gave them an ankle bites them and says, no, guys, let that go. And this is disastrous. Portugal falls apart. They lose their colonial empire and it turns into a rump state and becomes basically like poverty induced for ages then afterwards. Like Portugal's empire was nearly the size of Europe. And then by the 70s, they were going through nearly communist revolutions themselves. So this is this total breakdown of the European imperial world empire. This in this beginning of the idea that we have to have a good relationship with the colored people of the world in order to compete with communism. And then obviously all these other forces taking place. So this sets up this context then for wokeism. There's a baby crying outside because of how hard I'm going. So what takes place in this 60s context is a critical pivot and transformation of this left-wing movement, of the spirit of the left. Because what basically happens is this reformation by Kennedy is actually quite successful. America becomes this propagandistic empire that produces 1960s rock and roll. It is a party for everyone in the world. It's about being wealthy, about being creative and musical. And this militant, aggressive, resentful Soviets, this manly undermensch fight where you throw this proletariat revolution, it all of a sudden starts to look a little bit frigid, a little bit hateful, and they get out-framed. And so the Soviets begin to lose political credibility, and especially during the 80s, it's just like America is cruising. You've got all the glam rock happening, and everybody's like, this is so cool. There's black people in films and stuff. Everybody's like, this seems like a party where everybody's invited. This is awesome. And you can go and you can immigrate to America, and you can do all of this stuff, and US aid is flooding in, and it's this party over the whole world. Everybody loves it. Soviet Union fails. This militant, revolutionary Yuri Bezmenov style, callous, cold, ruthless Soviet project that weaponizes resentment fails. Implosion takes place in 1991. But what happened in the 60s is that many of these principles, which were done perhaps for a function with a lot of other things lumped on top of it, obviously they get transformed into absolute reality. Everybody thinks this is exactly how we should run the world. No one pauses and said, well, we did this for a reason. Is this the right plan that we're following now? And during the 60s, you see this morphing into a middle-class leftism. You get like Herbert Marcuse. He's from the Frankfurt School, an outsider as well, But he is theorizing about how to do, what is the purpose of a left-wing revolution? What is the purpose of these things? And of course, the idea is that you have these Gnostic problems. You feel tyrannized by reality, the state and its norms, such as you have to be Christian and go and get your job in the factory and form a gender role as a wife or a husband. These one-dimensional norms, this is what Marcuse brings up, these one-dimensional norms, these suck. This life path that we're offered, this heteronormative, phallogocentric life path, it's frigid. And we're entering into the 60s. We're entering into the wealth abundance. We're entering into a realm of openness, of psychedelics, the low PMFC period, where we don't have to worry about threats anymore. And we actually are free to explore an individualized conscience. So what happens here? Marcuse says this one-dimensional man is bad. The revolution that needs to take place is the ability to be an individual. In whatever way you so wish. Switch off that posterior medial frontal cortex. Don't engage with evolutionary substructures like gender roles. Don't engage with these life paths that are set out. All this Christianity and nationalism, fuck this. Get rid of this. And this is appealing to people. This is what you see then expressed through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. This way of thinking is very dominant. Be yourself. Express yourself. Become who you are. Become an individual. Even Nietzsche and Jung gets bent into shape to suit this, where Nietzsche's quotes, Nietzsche's whole philosophy is about become who you are. It's not about, the esoteric psychology of the future right wing. Strength is the answer to suffering. It's not that. It's individualism. Become yourself. An Übermensch is self-expression. An Übermensch is someone with a low PMFC. This is what it is. So Marcuse sets this stage, and you will recognize this because this is the dominant cultural substructure of our current reality. And you get a lot of conservative midwits who literally take on these principles and claim they're rebelling against them. This is so common. I see it all the time. And I find it very funny, because they're promoting individualism. Individualism is the psychology of the West is individualism. This is the values of the West. The propositions of the West is our individualism. And it's like, no, that was the Cultural Revolution in the 60s. Individual, free expression, don't be one-dimensional. Basically, don't be conservative and don't be a Christian and don't be these things. Become something else. Explore occultism. Try out Hinduism. Try out Buddhism. Try out yoga. Go to the out. Reject the one center. And this is what you see happen here. So this becomes a middle-class cultural norm. And as people like Gramsci say, another leftist theorist, the revolution does not necessarily happen in the political state. It happens in the cultural systems, the institutions, the cultural hegemony. And so now all of a sudden you see the overthrowing of Christianity, the overthrowing of nationalism, the overthrowing of pretty much any sense of self-pride and worship, and this beginning of bending towards the outgroup. And even the concept of American nationalism gets defined by freedom and individualism. And that's what it becomes. And it's not like this wasn't powerful. There's a lot of things about this that are incredibly compelling. And I think a lot of people who think of themselves as right-wing should be careful, because throwing away with the things that you don't like, a lot of them, your ability to even decide to be what you are, your desire for freedom, like a lot of this comes from these type of things. And of course, it serves a function, kind of makes sense. This expressiveness of the West, the creative, colorful expressiveness of the West is very powerful against the rigid close-mindedness of the Soviet Union. But come 1990, that all implodes and you see the mood shift. And all these values radicalize. And all of these principles, like the open borders, they continue to radicalize. And a lot of the people, the boomers who grew up in the 60s and internalized these values, they're not Nietzschean critics of their own values. They radicalize their values. They try to do them more. They go harder. And their resentment doesn't get unchecked because they have the moral majority. They have the cultural hegemony on their side. So they can resent, they can bend this into pure hate for the white man. They can turn this into narcissistic pride for their outgroup. They can do this with a good conscience. They can transform individualism into a literal one-dimensional religion. They can do this. And this is what begins to happen. And in this time of great victory where they dominate the world, now it seems like this blossoms and consumes everything. And what happens then in 2010s, in 2015, 2016, is you see this impulse of a backlash take place. People begin to grip. The PMFC begins to turn on. Despite the fact that we live in the richest time ever, in the most comfortable time ever, with the most air conditioning and conveniences, The death of God is achieved. When does atheism reach its peak? The death of God is achieved in 2015. It's achieved in the 2010s. America were like 80% Christian, and they drop to 60% by the 2010s. The British majority belief system became atheism. It overthrew Christianity in the 2010s. It's very, very recently. And so this world domination of liberalism, of this left-wing thinking, of the shutting down of the PMFC, of this lifting up of this world perspective, the woke perspective as hegemonic, takes place. And us millennials, we're the harbingers. We're the heralds of the future, the heralds of the woke. This is what takes place. And then out of that comes the monstrous neo-Hitler response, you know. Out of this comes the reaction. Out of this comes the break with this hegemonic way of seeing things. And this huge aggressive nationalism begins to show up. And the PMFC turns on. And you see so many things that trigger this, even like things on social media where there's this migrant hordes coming into Germany, and everybody says these people are actually threatening us. They're dangerous, and that switches on that who's my group, who's my tribe. And then this begins to boil up, but everybody pushes away at it because it just seems it's so weak, this reaction. This impulse is so fickle and small because it's kind of like populist chud mob instincts against this lofty hegemonic set of principles such as freedom itself and individualism. And then you have people who are like making racist jokes on the internet. But this blossoms, and then comes 2020 and the lockdowns, and this woke project reveals the irony and hollowness of its values. It reveals itself as perfectly capable of tyranny. And this leads to this massive muscular flip. Belief in God begins to shoot upwards in the 2020s. And people pivot very heavy. And now you see in the youth that they're actually breaking the trend and becoming more religious than before. And this urge begins to shuttle and explode. And then a 1960s cultural revolution happens in the online grassroots sphere. It's like the 1960s psychedelic revolution, only instead of taking LSD, we're staring at our phones. And all the memes are making people hard right. Furthermore, the revelation of some of these deep Gnostic tendencies begin to expose themselves. Because in some sense, maybe an adaptive liberalism in response to communism, you can see how that can be okay. And a bit of individual expression never hurt anybody. But you see the muscular arrival and thrust of hard woke Gnosticism. This really aggressive hate for oneself. This really aggressive hate for the white man, hate for God. This begins to show up. And this really puts people off. You begin to see what this is in its core. It is a world negating perspective that is very psychologically damaging. You see the arrival of the phenomenon of the transsexual in its pure sense. People begin taking elaborate surgeries. There's people getting prescribed hormones. There's this attempt to shear apart the family. Kids end up getting these therapies done to themselves. And this is all very forceful and very extreme, very hardcore. So the woke lose their credit. A sort of populist psychology forms, and people begin to categorize these people as insane, as crazy, as Redditors. And this creates the culture war. But the problem is that the Trump movement, the reactionary force, succeeds. It gains ground and it becomes more profound, more enriched. Intellectuals show up. It gains more political power. It gets popular consensus. And what Trump does is something quite similar to Kennedy. Trump begins to enforce a restructuring of the American project. Look at all the tariffs. Look at the way he's gutting and allowing Elon Musk to show off what happened with the US aid project. He's showing people that this structure built in the 60s, it has gone awry. It's starting to become a problem. He begins to bring in crypto in an attempt to create this sort of financial buffer for the US Treasury bonds. He's doing all these very interesting and radical things to reforge the American empire, probably with the help and support of a counter-elite within the American project. So he's undoing the woke empire that was built since the 60s. And as a consequence, he has the legitimacy to do this. He wouldn't be able to do it otherwise unless he had a huge amount of legitimacy and cultural legitimacy. And this is very demoralizing for people who made big investments in woke. A lot of people bought into these identities to the point where they've done radical things like castrate themselves and things like this. And it's very brutal because these people who were telling them to do this were in some sense ideologues, exploiting perhaps, or maybe misdirecting them. Instead of offering them something that might have been spiritual to look at these problems they had inside of their mind, they put them on, hardcore hormones and things like this. And so this is having this radicalizing effect. Trump is successfully changing the empire. So all these people enormously invested in the empire, who have changed their lives forever as a participant in this culture, they're feeling existential dread. They're feeling very, very angry. And we have these avatars like Charlie Kirk presenting the heteronormative Christian man with a wife, business guy, promoting conservative values and arguing with you and stuff like this. And he becomes a target. He is the rise of this popular perspective. And this huge hate is directed at them. And of course, the American empire itself has become very decadent. It doesn't offer many of its individual citizens much salvation. It's a very exploitative and elitist empire at this point, with a very exploitative financial system. So a lot of the people at the bottom, a lot of the dregs, and this would include, look, us peasants, we're not the people with like billions of assets living in, all around the world and stuff like this. Most people are in dire straits. You have somebody like Luigi Mangione, who's not politicized. He's not left-wing, he's not really right-wing. He's like a centrist Andrew Huberman fan. But he gets botched up by the medical industrial complex and has his spine rewired, and he gets filled with resentment. And this resentment has no outlet but to target these exploiters, these insurance hustlers. So he goes and he executes one of them. You see the same phenomenon in the people who attacked Fuentes, in the transsexuals running after into the covenants and killing Christian children. There's this anguish inside of them. There's this school shooter brokenness inside a lot of people because of the end game of this liberal project seems to have just arrived at its logical conclusion. And there's a lot of anguish and a lot of despair. There's a lot of demons in society, a lot of twisted perversions inside of people. And this radicalizes now because it's been shut out. You can't express this. You can't feel that you're winning a culture war. It feels like your culture and your identity is getting closed off. This ability to freely express yourself and choose who you are as an individual, this seems to be getting bullied out. And instead a heteronormative, one-dimensional path is getting offered to people as this path to health. You will be happier and healthier if you just accept your gender role and accept life as it is. And so these people radicalize. They see no option. So what they're going to do is turn to violence. This is what has to happen. So this middle-class, cultural, kind of cutesy, let's be all individuals thing now feels like it's losing its grip on reality. And there's a lot of people full of demons, very broken, with deep psychological anguish. And the left can no longer give them satisfactory explanations for this. And so all it can really do is callously radicalize this. And this leads to an escalation in violence. And of course, the right wing is not without its own very jaded, upset people as well. The immigration project has radicalized a huge amount of people. Their threat detection centers are all turning on, and they're like the zealots in ancient Judea. They've gone hardcore. They're out there thinking to themselves, we've got to do something about this now. So what do we have here? These two boiling up vitriolic forces that are now looking at the idea of force, thinking that none of this stuff can be solved with talk anymore. The people who are talking are getting shot, and this leads to an escalation towards conflict. Now, let me step into the dodgy realm of predictions. There's a lot of directions that this could go, because we have this counter-elite in the Trump movement transitioning the American empire. And if they are able to legitimize what they're doing and successfully do it, they will be able to put down the left and offer people a better future, the American Golden Age. That will probably be something like 1960s Part 2, set things on a different direction, and things might get rosy, and the left will be outframed, delegitimized, and pushed away, and their violence will seem insane and weird and not something people want to get involved with. And this would be a very lucky situation and well-managed situation for the Trump movement. Now, they have a lot of problems because, for example, the Israeli-Gaza thing is twisting a lot of people's minds against them. That's actually costing them an awful lot of legitimacy. And it's something that is radicalizing an awful lot of the left because they're like, well, this regime is literally exterminating people. They're doing violence. So why should we care? And this could show us where things could go very negative because the left could maintain its legitimacy because of things like this, saying that these guys are evil fascist dictators that are happy to engage in violence. And they would be able to, rally the resentment within people. They would be able to say these ICE raids are an extension of this malice, this horrible force. And they will gain legitimacy. And then their violence looks vigilante. It looks revolutionary, it looks good. Taking on this beast. Somebody has to do it. I'm willing to go to prison for it. This is what some of these people will think. And their hate and their resentment, they can take it out on an enemy that is delegitimized as a monster. So you could have this situation where this terrorism will look like the breakdown of the woke psychology from an irrational perspective, going towards a noble aim at making a new golden age. Or it will look as something very legitimate against a hostile tyrannical regime. And people will develop this callous nihilism around this political violence. And that won't be good, because that means it will escalate. You will see what happens in low-level civil war. This happened in Argentina. This happened in Ireland with the Troubles. This happens with the Years of Lead in Italy, where basically during the Years of Lead in Italy, there is a centrist moderate state, and then you have a hard right faction, and then you have a hard left faction, and they're like doing gang warfare, basically, in this low-level chronic violence that lasts for 30 years. They even kidnap the prime minister at one point and execute him. This stuff gets hardcore, and it does not resolve itself for a long time because the escalation of violence is tit for tat, and then it blooms into low-level chronic civil war that remains, and trust in society breaks down. And it's important to keep in mind that we're sitting right at that point because during the 1960s, there were a wave of assassinations. There was Kennedy, there was Martin Luther King. The birth of this woke regime, this, Kennedy's project, it required death. It required this type of chaos. And you could look at what's gone on with the Trump regime so far, an attempt on Trump's life, Charlie Kirk getting executed, Fuentes having attempts on his life. This same birth is taking place. So this is a defining moment here. And maybe like Kennedy's regime, it could stabilize, but maybe not. Maybe it could sink down. And if it sinks down, this is very destructive. It's very, very bad. To give you an example, this is from a guy called Siloslav on Twitter, who describes the breakdown in tensions in Yugoslavia, in the Balkans. This was only recently in the 1990s itself. I was talking to a friend who grew up in Yugoslavia. He's about 10 years older than me and recently moved back to Serbia. What struck me about his recounting of the years just before the war began was a sense of banality, a kind of timelessness. Despite all the vitriol, it didn't really feel like anything was going to happen right away. But what set off the war, the conflict between the new Croatian state and Yugoslavia, was a single bus attack. A group of Serb paramilitaries opened fire on Croatian police officers near Pakrac, killing several and wounding others. That moment lit the fuse. From there, everything erupted. The war turned brutal very quickly, with civilians swept into atrocities. Imagine being raped in your own bedroom, beheaded in front of your family in the garden, grenades thrown through your window, your bones later collected and dropped into a village well. When I see young people today mocking the death of somebody they disagree with or speaking with ambivalence about assassination, I can't help but think they have no idea how fast things can change. They don't know that violence, once unleashed, doesn't stay contained. And this is something that I know from just speaking to people about the Troubles, which is something I'm definitely not a profound expert in or anything like this. But it was that same thing where actually during the 60s, the Catholics were trying a civil rights march and they decided, right, well, take it easy in the whole IRA thing for a little while. And then there was a wave of executions and some assassinations by the Protestants. And then very quickly, a breakdown in the civil order. The British state comes in and puts a hard foot down and controls the situation. But the two gangs, who were marked as terrorist groups by the establishment, formed this vigilante low-level chronic civil war, and it lasts for 30, 40 years. And you just don't get out of it. And it is absolutely eviscerating of culture, of trust. You can't trust anybody. You become paranoid. You think everybody's trying to screw you over. Everybody's in the other team. The posterior medial frontal cortex switches on to the absolute sense. And you get your hard ideology. You get your clear collective tribe and identity. You get what you want. You get your communism or whatever it is. You fall into something. Like in prison, you have to fall into the Aryan Brotherhood or the Nation of Islam. You have to go hardcore and become identitarian because you're in a fight for survival. But it is shearing. It is shearing to the quality of the culture. And in some sense, it's probably permanently destructive. Russia has, barely recovered from the communist fall. And it's this type of thing. Look how long it took China. It took China, the 1950s when they had the revolution? And only in the 2000s are they beginning to build up momentum again. So it seems like this is the precipice that everything sits on. Which direction it will take, I do not know. I'm just a boyo. But I would like to paint this picture for you because it's something I've thought about quite a lot. Thank you very much for your time. I'd like you all out there to stay juicy. And I'll say goodbye.